History doesn't always explode with grandeur. Sometimes, it whispers before it roars. And in the summer of 1914, all it took was one shot. A single bullet, fired from a hidden pistol in a quiet corner of Sarajevo, would ignite a war that would drag the entire world into the bloodiest conflict mankind had ever known. But to understand that moment, we need to go back to a continent, sitting on the edge of chaos. The early 20th century was a time of empire, ego and uneasy alliances. Europe then wasn't a place of peace. It was a tightly wound coil of military pacts, national pride, colonial ambition, and ethnic tension. The so-called great powers of the time, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Italy, were in a delicate and dangerous dance. They didn't trust each other, not really. Each had allies, secret deals, and armies ready to move at a moment's notice. Peace may have reigned on the surface, but the continent was a tinderbox. One of the most volatile regions was the Balkans, a rugged, ethnically diverse area in southeastern Europe, often referred to as the powder keg of Europe. And at the heart of that powder keg was Austria-Hungary, a decaying empire trying desperately to hold together a collection of different peoples: Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Hungarians, Austrians, Bosniaks, and more. Unlike modern nation-states, Austria-Hungary was a dual monarchy, two kingdoms under one emperor, Franz Joseph I, who had ruled since 1848. He was an old man by 1914, and his empire was old too, in every sense. Industrially behind Western Europe, politically unstable, and ethnically fragmented, the empire was showing cracks everywhere. One of its biggest problems was nationalism, the idea that each ethnic group should have its own country. The Serbs in particular wanted independence, or at the very least, they didn't want to be ruled by Austria-Hungary, and nearby, the small but fiercely proud country of Serbia was emerging as a symbol of Slavic resistance. Serbia had grown bolder after its victories in the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, which weakened the Ottoman Empire and expanded Serbian territory. And Serbia had a powerful ally, Russia, the Slavic big brother, who saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations. This made Austria-Hungary nervous. It saw Serbia as a threat, an agitator stirring rebellion within its own borders. So, when Austria-Hungary decided to assert itself in the Balkans, it annexed the region of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, territory that had been under Ottoman control, but administered by Austria-Hungary. This move enraged the Serbs. Many ethnic Serbs lived in Bosnia, and they now found themselves under Austrian rule. Fast forward to 1914. The aging Emperor Franz Joseph's nephew, and heir to the throne, was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a man with a reputation for being both reform-minded and stiffly unpopular. He was no warmonger. In fact, some historians believe he may have tried to prevent a larger war had he lived. But history has little use for what-ifs. Franz Ferdinand had planned a state visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, to observe military exercises and boost Austrian presence in the region. The date, June 28, 1914. What he didn't know, what the world didn't know, was that this seemingly routine visit would light the match that would set the globe on fire. In the shadows of Serbian nationalism, a secret group was operating, the Black Hand. Formed by Serbian military officers, this ultra-nationalist organization believed in unifying all Slavic peoples under a greater Serbia, and they believed violence was a legitimate tool. Among its members were young, radicalized men filled with purpose and rage. They were trained, armed, and told they could change history. One of them was Gavrilo Princip, a sickly 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, with tuberculosis and a burning sense of mission. Along with 5 other would-be assassins, Princip was smuggled into Bosnia with weapons and cyanide pills. Their goal: kill the Archduke when he visited Sarajevo. It wasn't just a murder, it was political theater, a strike against empire, a cry for independence. Sarajevo, on the morning of June 28, was tense. Security was present, but lax. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, arrived in an open-top car, traveling in a motorcade, along a set route through the city. As the cars rolled down the streets, the assassins stood in place, waiting. Some froze. One, Nedeljko Chabrinović, managed to throw a grenade at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off and exploded under the next vehicle, injuring members of the entourage and bystanders. Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing. "So this is how they welcome us," he reportedly said, but he was determined to finish the visit. Later that morning, after changing the route to visit the wounded in the hospital, the driver made a wrong turn. The car stalled, right in front of a small cafe, where Gavrilo Princip just happened to be standing, likely preparing to leave the area after the failed attempt. It was fate, or a deadly coincidence. Princip stepped forward. From a few feet away, he fired 2 shots. One struck Sophie in the abdomen. The other hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. They died minutes later. It was over in seconds. But the consequences would stretch across continents, across decades. One shot, and the world was never the same again. But how did this act of terrorism, this assassination of a royal figure in a small Balkan city, lead to a world war involving dozens of countries and millions of lives? The answer lies not just in the bullet, but in the tangled web of empires, alliances, and ambitions that followed it. In most murders, justice is sought, an investigation begins, and the world moves on. But this was no ordinary murder. This was a royal assassination, politically charged, emotionally explosive, and it set off a chain of decisions, so fast, so deadly, that within a month, the world would be at war. It began with fury, then ultimatums, then mobilizations. One after another, the dominoes fell. When news reached Emperor Franz Joseph, the reaction was cold and calculated. While the death of Franz Ferdinand shocked the empire, the emperor himself had always viewed his nephew with some disdain. But the assassination gave Austria-Hungary something far more powerful than grief, a pretext. In the halls of Vienna, leaders like Count Leopold Berchtold, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, saw an opportunity. Serbia had long been a thorn in the empire's side, challenging its authority, stirring nationalism in Bosnia, and aligning too closely with Russia. Now, Austria-Hungary had a justification to deal with Serbia once and for all. But there was a problem. Russia, Austria-Hungary, couldn't simply invade Serbia without risking retaliation from Russia, Serbia's Slavic protector. If Austria was going to act, it needed insurance. Enter Germany. The blank check. On July 5, 1914, just a week after the assassination, Austria-Hungary turned to its most powerful ally, Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the bold and erratic ruler of Germany, was informed of Austria's desire to punish Serbia. Germany, bound by alliance and driven by its own strategic fears, gave Austria what would come to be known as the blank check. They promised unconditional support, even if Russia intervened. It was a crucial moment. Had Germany hesitated, Austria might have backed down. But emboldened by Berlin, Vienna began preparing its next move. The July Ultimatum. On July 23, 1914, Austria-Hungary issued a deliberately harsh ultimatum to Serbia. It contained 10 demands, most of which Serbia could not reasonably accept without compromising its sovereignty. Among them, Serbia must suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, dismiss certain military officers, allow Austrian officials to participate in the investigation on Serbian soil. This final demand was especially inflammatory. It would effectively allow Austria to operate inside Serbia's borders. No sovereign nation could accept that without surrendering its dignity. Serbia's response. Serbia, under enormous pressure and aware of the military threat looming, responded with surprising diplomacy. On July 25, it accepted most of the conditions, agreeing to everything but the demand for Austrian involvement in their legal process. It wasn't enough. Austria-Hungary declared the response unsatisfactory, and within 48 hours, it mobilized for war. The web of alliances tightens from here. The speed of events becomes dizzying. July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. July 29, Russia, alarmed by the threat to Serbia, begins partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary. July 30, Russia orders full mobilization. Germany, watching Russia's moves with increasing anxiety, sees mobilization as an act of war. German military planners, guided by the Schlieffen Plan, know they cannot afford to fight Russia and France, Russia's ally, separately. They must strike quickly. The Schlieffen Plan, and Germany's gamble. Here's where things escalate further. Germany had long anticipated a two-front war. Their solution was the Schlieffen Plan, a bold sweeping strategy to invade France through Belgium, defeat it quickly, and then turn all forces east to fight Russia. But there was a catch. Belgium was neutral, and Britain had pledged to defend that neutrality. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, and began its invasion of Belgium. This final act dragged Great Britain into the war. On August 4th, 1914, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. In just 5 weeks, what began as a regional crisis, an assassination in Sarajevo, had exploded into a full-blown world war. By August, the main powers were drawn into the conflict. Austria-Hungary versus Serbia, Germany versus Russia, Germany versus France, Britain versus Germany, and soon, nations across the globe, colonies, dominions and allies, would join in. From Canada to India, Japan to Australia, the world was mobilizing. The dominoes had not only fallen, they had shattered an entire era. No one expected it to happen this fast. No one thought a war involving all of Europe could begin over a single assassination. But the powder keg had been waiting for a spark, and when it came, no one could stop the explosion. The war would consume millions, and change the world forever. But this was just the beginning. In the summer of 1914, millions marched off to war with songs in their hearts and victory in their minds. It would be quick, they believed. A few bold battles, a bit of bloodshed, and home by Christmas. They had no idea that they were stepping into a nightmare. The world had never seen war like this before, and it would never be the same again. In cities across Europe, the outbreak of war was met with euphoria. Crowds cheered, soldiers were given flowers. Young men, some still teenagers, rushed to enlist. For many it felt like an adventure, a chance to prove manhood, to defend honor, to join history. They had grown up on tales of glorious cavalry charges and short decisive campaigns, but what awaited them was nothing like the wars of the past. Germany, following its pre-war military blueprint, launched its ambitious Schlieffen Plan. The goal, avoid a two-front war by swiftly defeating France before Russia could fully mobilize. To do that, Germany invaded neutral Belgium on August 4, 1914, intending to swing down into northern France like a hammer. But this move had two unexpected consequences. It violated Belgian neutrality, triggering Britain to declare war on Germany. It delayed the German advance, as Belgian resistance, especially at the fortress of Liège, was far more stubborn than expected. Despite the delay, Germany pressed forward, defeating French and British forces in battles across northern France. Towns fell, civilians fled, and the German army approached Paris. In early September 1914, German forces were just 30 miles from Paris. The French government evacuated the capital. Panic spread, but then something unexpected happened. From September 5 to 12, French and British forces launched a massive counterattack along the Marne River, using taxis from Paris to rush reinforcements to the front. French troops halted the German advance. This moment, later dubbed the Miracle of the Marne, forced the Germans to retreat. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. The hope for a quick victory evaporated. After the Marne, both sides tried to outflank each other in what became known as the Race to the Sea. This maneuvering stretched the front line northward to the English Channel. When neither side could outmaneuver the other, they began to dig in. From the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, two lines of trenches emerged, defensive networks that would soon define the war. This was the birth of the Western Front, and with it came a new kind of warfare, trench warfare. The trenches were more than ditches. They were vast systems of zigzagging lines, fortified with sandbags, barbed wire, and bunkers. Life in them was miserable. Soldiers stood knee-deep in mud. Rats and lice infested every corner. Disease spread easily, and worst of all, death was constant. Artillery barricades shook the earth. Snipers watched for any careless movement. Gas attacks would soon add a new terror to life on the front lines. The war had gone from swift movement to deadlock, a brutal stalemate with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. World War I became a laboratory for modern killing. The industrial age met the battlefield, and the results were devastating. Machine guns could mow down entire waves of charging infantry. Barbed wire turned open fields into death traps. Heavy artillery destroyed trenches, villages and mines. In 1915, poison gas made its horrific debut,
chlorine and mustard gas that choked, blinded and burned. This was not war as their fathers knew it. This was mechanical slaughter on a scale no one had seen before. While the West bogged down in trenches, the Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, remained more mobile. Here Russia faced off against Germany and Austria-Hungary. At the Battle of Tannenberg, August 1914, Germany won a stunning victory over Russia, destroying the Russian Second Army. But Russia's sheer size and manpower kept the front alive. Unlike the West, vast spaces allowed armies to maneuver. Still, the war in the East was no less brutal. Millions died in battles that gained little ground. By late 1914, other nations were drawn into the conflict. Japan, honoring its alliance with Britain, declared war on Germany and seized its Pacific colonies. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East. British colonies, from Canada to Australia to India, sent troops to support the Allies. This was no longer a European war. It was becoming a world war, a true global conflict, stretching from the sands of Mesopotamia, to the jungles of Africa to the icy waters of the North Sea. By the end of 1914, the war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Soldiers huddled in freezing trenches, families mourned sons who had marched off in joy and never returned, and leaders, still clinging to old strategies, refused to believe what the war had become. Hope fades, reality sets in as winter set in. Soldiers began to realize the war would not be short. Letters home carried fewer words of glory and more of despair. Wounded men filled field hospitals. Civilians suffered food shortages and rising prices. But perhaps no moment captured the tragic irony of the war's first year better than the Christmas truce of 1914. On Christmas Eve, soldiers on both sides briefly laid down their weapons. They sang carols, exchanged gifts, and even played football in no man's land. It was a flicker of humanity in a war that had become inhuman. But by New Year's, the killing resumed. They had marched off thinking they would be heroes. Instead they became witnesses to horror. 1914 had opened with parades and promises. It ended with trenches, tears, and the realization that this war would not be won quickly or easily. By 1915, the First World War had spread far beyond the muddy trenches of France. It was no longer just Europe's war, it was the world's. From the deserts of the Middle East to the shores of Gallipoli, from colonial skirmishes in Africa to battles in the Alps, World War I devoured men, nations and empires. The war machine had no brakes, and it was gaining speed. As the calendar flipped to 1915, the Western Front had solidified into a frozen line of misery. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, neither side could gain the upper hand. In an attempt to break the stalemate, both the Allies and Central Powers launched massive offensives. Names like Neuve-Chapelle, Ypres and Loos became etched into the grim ledger of war. But the pattern remained the same. Weeks of bombardment, a surge over the top, gains measured in yards, paid for in thousands of lives. By now the war had become a meat grinder. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces introduced a weapon that horrified even hardened soldiers: poison gas. Cylinders of chlorine were opened, releasing a yellow-green cloud that drifted into Allied trenches. Men choked, coughed blood, and collapsed in agony. It was the first large-scale gas attack in history, and it changed the face of war. Soon, both sides adopted gas warfare. Variants like phosgene and mustard gas followed, burning lungs, blinding eyes, and contaminating the very air soldiers breathed. Gas masks became standard issue. But even then, fear of gas attacks haunted the trenches every day. While the Western Front remained locked, the Allies looked for other ways to strike. One idea: knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. The result was the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. In April 1915, British, French, Australian and New Zealand Anzac forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in modern-day Turkey. Their objective: seize the Dardanelles Strait and capture Constantinople. But they underestimated the Ottomans, especially a rising general named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk.
The terrain was brutal. The defenders were prepared. The invaders were pinned down on the beaches for 8 months. By January 1916, the Allies had withdrawn. Over 250,000 casualties later, Gallipoli stood as a symbol of strategic failure, and needless loss. Elsewhere, the Ottoman Empire became a major theatre of war. In Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, British Indian forces tried to capture Baghdad, but were surrounded and forced to surrender at Kut al-Amara in 1916. In the Arabian Peninsula, unrest stirred. The British, through the infamous Hussein McMahon correspondence, encouraged Arab tribes to revolt against Ottoman rule, planting seeds for later betrayal and conflict. Meanwhile, Lawrence of Arabia, a British liaison officer, would soon become a legendary figure in the Arab revolt. The Middle East, once seen as a secondary front, was becoming a key battleground. In May 1915, Italy, once aligned with the Central Powers, entered the war on the side of the Allies. Italy hoped to gain territory from Austria-Hungary, especially in the Alps, and along the Adriatic coast. What followed were a dozen brutal battles along the Isonzo River, where Italian and Austro-Hungarian troops fought in freezing mountains and sheer cliffs. Progress was minimal, losses were enormous. The Italian front, like so many others, became a test of endurance more than tactics. Though often overshadowed, World War I saw fighting across Africa and Asia as well. In Africa, Allied forces fought German colonial troops in modern-day Tanzania, Cameroon, and Namibia. German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a cunning guerrilla campaign that tied down tens of thousands of Allied troops. In China, Japan seized Germany's territory in Shandong province and its Pacific Island holdings, setting up future tensions with China and the West. Across the globe, empires flexed their reach, and colonies became battlefields. While battles raged on land, another war unfolded at sea. The British Royal Navy imposed a blockade on Germany, strangling its economy and starving its people. In response, Germany turned to a deadly weapon, the U-boat, or submarine. These stealthy vessels struck without warning, targeting Allied shipping. One of the most infamous incidents came on May 7, 1915, when the RMS Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. Though the US would not enter the war for another 2 years, the Lusitania sinking stirred public outrage and began to shift American opinion. By the end of 1915, it was clear this was not a war of swift victory. It was a war of attrition. Millions had died or been wounded. Civilians faced famine, displacement, and economic collapse. Empires strained under the weight of endless casualties and dwindling morale. Technology had advanced, but tactics lagged behind. Generals still ordered frontal assaults against machine guns. Thousands died to gain a hill, a village, a trench, only to lose it days later. What began with one bullet in Sarajevo had now become a global inferno. There was no end in sight, only more fronts, more weapons, more graves. And as 1916 approached, the war was about to enter its most brutal year yet, a year of slaughter, sorrow, and the breaking point of empires. By 1916, World War I was no longer just a war, it was a calamity, a grinding machine, chewing through nations, ideals, and generations. It was the year that redefined what war could do, not only to armies, but to entire civilizations, and at its center stood two names that would echo through history with one word: blood. In February 1916, Germany launched an offensive aimed at the symbolic heart of France, the fortress city of Verdun. German commander Erich von Falkenhayn believed France would bleed itself dry defending Verdun. His goal wasn't just victory, it was attrition. He wanted to bleed France white. Over the next 10 months, the battle would become one of the longest and most brutal in human history. German artillery unleashed a hellish bombardment, over 2.5 million shells in the opening phase alone. French soldiers, determined to hold at all costs, rotated through the line in what became known as the Sacred Way, a single supply road that brought in men and munitions around the clock. One phrase captured it all: "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. By the end of the battle in December, nearly 800,000 casualties had been suffered on both sides. The front lines had barely moved. Verdun became a symbol not just of national resistance, but of the horror and futility of modern war. While Verdun raged, the Allies planned their own major offensive, the Battle of the Somme. The goal was twofold: break through German lines on the Western Front. On July 1, 1916, The British launched their assault after a week-long artillery bombardment that they believed had destroyed enemy defences. It had not. As British soldiers went over the top, they were met with a storm of machine gun fire. That day became the single bloodiest day in British military history. Over 57,000 casualties, 19,000 dead, in a single day. And the battle was just beginning. It lasted until November 1916, grinding on in waves of mud, shellfire, and slaughter. Tanks made their debut, slow, unreliable, but terrifying in their novelty. By its end, Allied casualties, 620,000 German casualties, 500,000 land gained. About 6 miles. The world was stunned. Could any victory be worth this? 1916 marked the first appearance of the tank, an armored vehicle meant to cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and support infantry. The British Mark I made its debut at the Somme. Early models were slow, prone to mechanical failure, and often broke down before reaching the enemy. But their psychological impact was enormous, giant iron beasts crawling across no man's land. The tank was a preview of the mechanized warfare that would come to define the 20th century. Though crude, its potential was undeniable. While the West bled, the Eastern Front saw its own moment of ferocious combat. In June 1916, Russia launched the Brusilov offensive against Austria-Hungary. It was one of the most successful operations of the war. Russian General Alexei Brusilov used surprise, infiltration tactics, and coordinated attacks. He shattered Austro-Hungarian lines, capturing thousands of prisoners. But the success came at a cost. Russian losses were also massive. Their army began to strain under shortages, poor leadership, and growing unrest. Brusilov's offensive weakened Austria-Hungary so badly that Germany had to take over its defense. But for Russia, the strain was irreversible. By 1916, air power had evolved from reconnaissance to full combat. Fighter planes now roamed the skies, engaging in dogfights with machine guns mounted on their wings. Aces like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, began to capture public imagination. Airships like the German Zeppelins bombed cities, including London, introducing civilians to the terror of aerial warfare. Though primitive by today's standards, air combat symbolized the changing face of war, vertical, technological, and increasingly indiscriminate. As millions fought on the front lines, the people back home were also under siege. Food shortages gripped cities. Rationing became common. Propaganda filled newspapers, films, and posters, calling for sacrifice, demonizing the enemy, glorifying the cause. Women stepped into factories, farms, and offices, replacing the men at war, and laying the groundwork for future social change. But cracks were showing. In Germany, the British blockade had created famine conditions. In Russia, protests simmered beneath the surface. Even in France and Britain, people began asking, why are we still fighting? 1916 was the year hope began to die. New leaders, new directions. That year also saw major changes in leadership. In Britain, David Lloyd George rose to power, promising a more aggressive war strategy. In Germany, Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over military command, bringing a more total militarized direction to the German war effort. The war was becoming increasingly centralized, increasingly desperate, and increasingly destructive. Verdun, the Somme, Brusilov, 1916, gave the world new definitions of hell. It exposed the lie of glory and the illusion of a swift victory. It burned through men, machines, and morale, and it left every nation staring into an abyss from which none would escape unchanged. The breaking point approaches. As 1916 came to a close, soldiers began to mutiny. Civilians questioned their leaders. Revolution loomed on the horizon, and far across the Atlantic, a sleeping giant began to stir. The war had destroyed the past. What came next would reshape the future. By 1917, the world was exhausted. The war that was supposed to last a summer had become a global nightmare, with no end in sight. But pressure builds, and when it becomes too great, something breaks. In these final 2 years, the cracks split wide, empires fell, revolutions ignited, and from the ashes of the old world, something new began to rise, but not without cost. By early 1917, Russia was on the brink.
The war had drained its economy, destroyed morale, and left cities starving. Soldiers at the front were dying by the thousands with little support or leadership. The Tsar, Nicholas II, remained isolated and ineffective. In March 1917, the dam broke. Mass protests in Petrograd, fueled by hunger and rage, led to a general strike. The military refused to fire on the crowds. Instead, many joined them. Tsar Nicholas abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, was no more. A provisional government took over, promising reform. But it made a fatal mistake. It kept Russia in the war. Later that year, in November 1917, a radical group seized power, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Their promise, peace, bread, land, Lenin, immediately began negotiating an exit from the war. America enters the war. Across the Atlantic, the United States had remained neutral, but neutrality was becoming harder to maintain. German U-boats had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American ships. The Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal to Mexico to join the war against the US, was intercepted and published, outraging the American public. On April 6, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. He framed the conflict as a crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy. At first, America's military presence was small, but the economic and industrial support it offered was enormous. And soon, doughboys, young American soldiers began arriving by the thousands. The balance was beginning to tip. With Russia exiting the war in early 1918, Germany transferred nearly 1 million soldiers from the Eastern Front to the West. In March 1918, they launched a desperate gamble, the Spring Offensive, using stormtrooper tactics. Fast-moving, lightly equipped troops, Germany broke through Allied lines and pushed closer to Paris than they had since 1914. The German army was exhausted. Supply lines stretched thin, morale faltered. By summer, with fresh American forces arriving daily, the Allies launched a massive counterattack, the 100 Days Offensive. Germany began to retreat, and fast. As Germany faltered, its allies began to fall. Austria-Hungary was tearing itself apart from within, nationalities demanding independence, the empire dissolving. The Ottoman Empire, reeling from defeat in the Middle East, signed an armistice in October 1918. Bulgaria had already surrendered in September. By November, only Germany remained. In the streets of Berlin, revolution erupted. Workers and soldiers formed councils, inspired by the Russian model. The navy mutinied. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. On November 11, 1918, at 5 a.m., Germany signed the armistice. At 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. Aftermath. A shattered world. The war was over, but peace would be elusive. 17 million dead, 20 million wounded, empires destroyed. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman and Russian. A map of Europe had to be redrawn. New nations emerged: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others. Old grievances remained, and new ones were born. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the victorious powers drafted the Treaty of Versailles. Its terms were harsh. Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, surrender territory, and disarm. Many Germans felt humiliated, betrayed. Seeds of future anger were planted. Meanwhile, the League of Nations was formed, Wilson's dream of a body to prevent future wars. But the US Senate refused to join. Its power was crippled from the start. Beyond politics and treaties, the war left a deep psychological wound. A lost generation of writers, poets and artists emerged, trying to process the trauma. Shell shock, what we now know as PTSD, haunted veterans. Millions of widows, orphans, and broken families struggled to rebuild their lives. Technology had advanced, humanity had regressed, and all because of one moment, 4 years earlier, in Sarajevo. In the summer of 1914, a single shot rang out, a bullet that tore through a young man's body, and through the fabric of the old world. What followed was more than war. It was the collapse of an era, the end of certainty, and the beginning of a new age. An age built not on peace, but on the ashes of empires. The war was over, But the world would never be the same again.